I will tell you how my brother, the most feared duke in the north of England, bought a woman at auction on a Tuesday evening in November, and how that single act, which the whole of London society called disgraceful, became the only decent thing any of us had done in years. My name is Lord Callum Dreving. I am the younger brother of Alastair Dreving, Duke of Caldreg, and I was standing 3 feet behind him the night the whole business began at Pemberton Hall. I want you to understand something before I go further. My brother is not a sentimental man. He is not given to gestures. He does not rescue things, not birds, not causes, not reputations. He is the kind of man who walks into a room and the room goes quiet, not because he announces himself, but because something in the air changes, the way it does before a storm rolls off the moors. Lords who have quarreled with him for decades cross the street to avoid him. His solicitors charge a premium simply for the association. I say all of this so that what happened at Pemberton Hall does not sound like a fairy story. It was not. It was my brother being exactly himself, and a young woman being exactly herself, and the two of them somehow making a world that had decided her worth in pounds sterling look very, very small. It was Lord Crispin Vane who sent the invitation. He was not Miss Alara Vane's father. Her father, the late Lord Harold Vane, had been dead 8 months by then, leaving behind a hemorrhage of debts, an estate mortgaged past redemption, and 2 daughters. Alara was the elder, 24 years of age. Her sister, Myra, was 17. Crispin Vane was their father's brother, a man with the soft hands and hard eyes of someone who has never done an honest day's work, but has always profited from the work of others. He had stepped in as guardian with what he called dutiful sorrow, and what I recognized, having met him twice, as the cheerful acquisitiveness of a man who had just inherited a problem he intended to sell. The invitation was worded carefully, as such things always are. A private gathering of gentlemen at Pemberton Hall, for the purpose of settling the late Lord Vane's estate obligations through the most advantageous possible arrangement. The advantageous arrangement, as every man in that room understood, was a marriage. Not a marriage of consideration or affection. A marriage of debt. Alara Vane would be presented, and the assembled gentlemen, 12 of them, I counted, would make their offers, and the most financially useful one would win. Her uncle would pocket the settlement sum, the debts would be cleared, and the young woman would have the honor of belonging to whichever man in that room most wanted a bankrupt gentleman's daughter to do with as he saw fit. I did not want to be there. I said as much to Alastair in the carriage on the way up the North Road. He had not been invited. He had heard about the gathering through his solicitor, who had heard it from a land agent, who had been asked to assess the Vane estate's remaining assets. My brother had obtained the details, said nothing for 3 days, and then told me to get my coat. "You are not invited," I said for the 4th time, as Pemberton Hall's torches appeared through the sleet. "No," he agreed. "Crispin Vane will be furious." "Yes." "And you intend to do what exactly?" He looked out the window at the sleet. "I intend to observe," he said, "and then I intend to make the highest bid." I stared at him. "You are going to buy a woman." "I am going to prevent 11 other men from doing so first." I had no answer for that. I never did with Alastair. The hall was warm and overlit in the way that pretentious gatherings tend to be, as if an excess of candles can compensate for a shortage of dignity. The gentlemen present were exactly what I expected. A baron with a drinking problem that his tailor had done his best to disguise, 2 younger sons of earls with more ambition than income, a widowed mill owner who had decided that a title's daughter might improve his children's prospects, a viscount of middling rank who had been turned down by every woman in 3 counties and had apparently decided to resolve the situation commercially, and others of similar character. My brother walked in behind me, and the room did that thing rooms do. Crispin Vane came forward, flushed with either wine or indignation or both. "Your Grace," he said, with the smile of a man who has just realized he cannot throw the Duke of Keldreg out without making a very expensive enemy. "We were not aware you had an interest in." "Carry on," my brother said, and moved to stand at the back of the room by the fireplace, and Crispin Vane, to his eternal discredit, carried on. "She came in through the door at the far end of the room, and that is the moment I want you to hold in your mind, because it is the moment everything in this story turns on, though none of us knew it yet. She was not what I expected. That sounds like a small thing, but it was not. I had expected a girl crushed by circumstance, eyes down, shoulders drawn, the posture of someone who has been told repeatedly that she is a problem to be solved. What came through that door was a young woman who had made a decision, somewhere between the bedroom where she had dressed and the hallway where she had paused to collect herself, that she was not going to let any of these men see her broken. She wore a dark blue gown that had been mended at the left sleeve. I noticed because I was watching carefully, and because the mending was fine and neat and done by someone who took pride even in that. Her hair was simply arranged. Her hands were clasped in front of her. And she looked, when she entered that room, not at the floor, not at her uncle, and not at any of the assembled gentlemen. She looked at the far wall, just above all of their heads, as if she had found a fixed point in the distance and intended to keep her eyes on it no matter what happened in the space between. My brother did not move, but I saw his jaw tighten. Crispin Vane introduced her with the cheerful briskness of a livestock auctioneer. The late Lord Vane's eldest daughter, 24 years of age, in excellent health, well-read, accomplished at the pianoforte, fluent in French, experienced in the management of a household. He listed her attributes the way a salesman lists the qualities of a horse, and I watched her face throughout, and her face gave him nothing. Not contempt, she was too composed for contempt. Not fear, or if there was fear, she had put it somewhere very far down and stood on top of it. What her face gave the room was a kind of absolute, unassailable patience, as if she had decided that this was simply weather, and weather passes, and she would wait it out. The bidding started at £300. I will not walk you through every offer, because the memory of it still makes me want to stand up and leave whatever room I happen to be in. What I will tell you is that by the time it reached 650, 3 of the gentlemen had dropped away, and the remaining bidders had taken on a competitive edge that had less to do with Miss Vane herself and more to do with winning, the way men at auction always confuse the two. The Baron with the drinking problem dropped out at 700, either because he had reached the limit of what his allowance permitted, or because he had encountered something in Miss Vane's still expression that gave him momentary pause. I prefer to believe the latter, though I have no evidence for it. The Viscount, who had been turned down by every woman in 3 counties, pushed aggressively to 800 with the air of a man who believes he is finally winning something, until the mill owner surpassed him with a flat bid of 850, delivered in the tone of someone who has concluded a business calculation and considers the matter settled. Through all of it, she stood there and looked at the wall above their heads. I have thought about that often in the years since. The extraordinary discipline of it, the absolute refusal to give any of them the thing they might have felt entitled to, her distress, her deference, her acknowledgement that what they were doing had any power over what she was. She could not stop the auction. She could not prevent the bids, but she could stand there with her eyes on the far wall and deny them the satisfaction of her fear, and she did, for every minute of it, without wavering. My brother said very quietly from the back of the room, £1,000. The room stopped. Crispin Vane blinked. The mill owner turned. Every head swiveled toward the fireplace, where Alastair Dreving, Duke of Keldreg, was standing with his hands behind his back, and his expression suggesting that he had said nothing more remarkable than the time of day. "Your Grace," Crispin Vane said, after a pause in which the room recalibrated itself entirely. That is, I was not aware you were participating." £1,000, my brother repeated. "Do you require me to spell it?" No further bids were offered. It was the mill owner who tried, briefly, 1,000 and, but my brother's gaze moved to him, and the man seemed to discover he was not nearly as interested in winning as he had previously believed. The room cleared with the efficiency of people who have realized they are standing somewhere they would rather not be associated with. My brother walked forward through the departing bodies, and I followed him, because that is what I do. She was still standing at the end of the room. She had not moved. Her uncle was at her elbow, wearing an expression caught between gratification and wariness, the expression of a man who has sold something to a buyer he does not entirely understand. My brother stopped in front of her. He looked at her directly, and she, for the first time since she had entered the room, lowered her gaze from the middle distance and looked back at him. "Miss Vane," he said. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was level, entirely extraordinarily level. "I have a proposal for you, not an offer, a proposal. You are at liberty to decline it." She watched him. "I am in need of someone to oversee the library and correspondence at Keldraig. The position is that of household secretary. Your French will be useful, your management experience more so. You will be paid a salary. You will have your own rooms and the full use of the library. Your sister," he paused, and I saw something shift in her face at the word, the first real thing I had seen move across it. "Your sister will be given a position in the household as well, under whatever arrangement you prefer, until such time as better circumstances present themselves. You are not obligated to accept. If you do not, I will request that your uncle return the sum to me, and we will consider the evening concluded." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that I counted the seconds, not knowing why. "My sister," she said, "you would bring her as well." "I have said so." Another pause. "The salary." He named a figure. Her expression did not change, but I noted the very small, very controlled breath she took. "And I am free to leave," she said, "if the arrangement proves unsuitable." "You are free to leave whenever you choose," he said. "I have no interest in holding anyone against their will. I have a great deal of interest in having my library properly organized, and a decided lack of interest in men who believe another person's misfortune is an opportunity." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she said, "I accept your proposal, Your Grace," and she said it the way she had stood in that room, simply, without performance, with the quiet and absolute dignity of someone who has decided that if the world insists on being monstrous, she will be courteous to it anyway. Her uncle blustered for some time afterward, about arrangements, about the family name, about what society would make of all this. My brother looked at him with the particular expression he reserves for people he has already mentally dismissed and said, "Your niece's circumstances are settled. I suggest you address your own." And then he walked out, and Miss Vane followed him, and I followed her, and that was the end of Pemberton Hall. In the carriage, Myra Vane, fetched from a neighbor's house where she had been staying while all this was arranged, a girl of 17 with her sister's dark eyes and considerably less of her sister's composure, sat across from us and asked approximately 40 questions in the space of 20 minutes, most of them addressed to my brother, and most of them receiving answers of 3 words or fewer. My brother tolerated this with what I can only describe as the patience of a man who has decided to tolerate something and is seeing it through by sheer will. Miss Vane sat beside her sister and answered the questions Alistair did not, and once, just once, she caught my eye across the dark carriage, and I saw, for the first time, that there was something behind the composure. Not fear still, something quieter, something like a person who has been holding their breath for 8 months and has just, in some very small way, exhaled. Keldraig Castle stands on the edge of the northern moors about 4 hours north of London, where the sky gets bigger and the wind has opinions. My brother has always said he prefers it to town, which is true, but the real reason he prefers it is that in London everyone knows what he is, feared, cold, the Duke of Keldrag, a man who has fought 2 duels and won both, and still has the manners to apologize for it afterward. While at Keldrag he is just Alistair, who walks the moors before breakfast and drinks his tea too strong, and once spent a winter cataloguing every volume in the library because he had nothing better to do. The castle is large and draughty, and full of books and several dogs of indeterminate breed who have appropriated most of the comfortable chairs. Miss Myra Vane fell in love with it immediately. She stood in the entrance hall with the look of someone who has been cold for a very long time and has just walked into warmth, and within 10 minutes had introduced herself to 2 kitchen maids, discovered the existence of the library cats, and asked the housekeeper if she was allowed to explore. Miss Alara Vane looked at it with the careful, measuring attention of someone who is deciding whether a place can be trusted. She took in the height of the stone walls, the depth of the fires burning in the grates, the age of the tapestries, the quality of the light from the high windows. She was, I realized, not simply deciding whether the castle was comfortable. She was deciding whether it was safe. Whether the men who ran this place, my brother, the steward, the solicitors, were the kind of men who meant what they said. I watched her doing it, and I found I could not resent the scrutiny. She had been given very little cause in her 24 years to trust the things men told her. She settled into her work within 3 days, which is faster than I have ever seen anyone settle into anything at Keldrag. The library, which had been in a state of creative disorder since my brother's last secretary departed, under circumstances I will not go into, except to say that the man should not have attempted to sell 3 first editions and assumed no one would notice, was overhauled with quiet, systematic efficiency. She made no fuss. She asked for what she needed: better lighting, a set of cataloging ledgers, access to the estate correspondence files, and when it was provided, she got on with the work and did not bother anyone. My brother noticed. I noticed him noticing, which is how I know. He had a habit of arriving in the library at the hour before dinner, ostensibly to retrieve a book. Actually, I now believe to observe the state of the cataloging, which was his way of observing the cataloging's executor without admitting to himself that he was doing so. He would take a volume from a shelf, stand near the window, read 3 pages, replace it, and leave. Miss Vane would continue working. She did not adjust her posture or her expression when he came in. She did not look up unless he spoke to her, and she answered any question he asked with the same level precision she brought to everything. The first real conversation they had was about translation. My brother had found a volume of letters, correspondence from the previous century, in French, relating to a property dispute that his grandfather had apparently never resolved. He brought it to her with the manner of a man issuing a professional request, which is to say, he set it on the desk in front of her and said, "Can you render these in English?" She looked at the volume, opened it, read 3 lines. "They are not in standard French," she said. He blinked. "I beg your pardon." The writer was from Brittany. The dialect is a little different. The legal vocabulary is also archaic, mid-1700s, I think. She turned a page. "I can translate them. It will take a few days. I will note where I am uncertain of the precise meaning." He stood very still for a moment. "You can read Breton dialect." "My mother was from the south of France," she said, without looking up. "Her family had connections to Brittany. She taught us the regional forms as well as the standard." She paused. "I will leave a margin note wherever the translation might be contested." He left the library. I was in the armchair by the fire with one of the dogs and a glass of brandy, and he came in and sat down in the chair across from me, and stared at the middle distance in the way he sometimes does when something has surprised him. "She can read 17th century Breton dialect," he said. "Can she?" She mentioned it as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Perhaps for her it is." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Her uncle had no idea who he was selling." I said nothing, because there was nothing to add to that. The weeks at Keldrag turned cold, and the moors turned gray, and Miss Alara Vane worked her way through the library with the orderly intensity of someone who has been given an enormous task and finds in it genuine satisfaction. She completed the Breton translation with annotations so precise and carefully argued that my brother's solicitor, when he finally saw them months later, asked who had prepared the document and had to be told twice before he believed it. She sorted 3 centuries of correspondence into a system that actually made sense. She wrote letters on my brother's behalf in an English so clean and well measured that 2 of his business correspondents wrote back to say that his communication had improved considerably, which I found extremely funny. She also, and this was the thing that I think undid my brother before he understood what was happening, looked after people, not in a demonstrative way, in the quiet, noticing way of someone who has had to look after things without any resources and has therefore become very efficient about it. She noticed when one of the kitchen maids was struggling with a load of firewood and said 3 words to the footman nearest her, and the problem was resolved without drama. She noticed when the groundskeeper's young daughter had been left waiting in the cold hall and brought her inside to sit by the library fire with a book, and when the groundskeeper came to collect his daughter, he found her asleep in the best chair with a dog on her feet. She noticed when the estate carpenter was in the wrong passage at the wrong hour, and had the kind of look that suggested he was about to make a structural decision without adequate information, and she asked him 3 questions that identified the actual problem in under 2 minutes and saved the East Wing corridor from a very expensive misunderstanding. She noticed when my brother, who had been corresponding under some strain with a land agent about a disputed tenancy, had drafted a letter that was technically correct and strategically disastrous, and she said, very gently, without being asked, "If I may, Your Grace, may I suggest a different approach?" She had the draft in her hand and a sheet of clean paper beside it, and she set out her suggested revision with the economy of someone who has done this 1,000 times. The approach was entirely different from his, warmer in its opening, firmer in its central terms, and it closed with a sentence that offered the land agent a face-saving interpretation of his own conduct. "He cannot comply if he cannot retreat with dignity," she said, and she showed him, and the approach worked, and 2 weeks later the tenancy dispute was resolved to everyone's satisfaction, including the agent's. He looked at her for a long moment afterward and said, "How did you see that?" "I managed my father's correspondence for 4 years," she said, "before his judgment began to fail. I know what a man reads when he is angry and what he hears when he is afraid. I saw my brother's face do something I have not seen it do in 20 years. He was moved. He covered it immediately, the way he always does, a slight straightening of the shoulders, a turn back to the papers, a brief and businesslike, 'Thank you, Miss Vane.' But I was in the corner and I saw it, and I noted it, and I thought about it later in the evening when I was alone, because it is the kind of thing that, once you have seen it, tells you exactly what is going to happen, even when the people involved do not yet know it themselves." Myra, for her part, had attached herself to the castle with the enthusiasm of a creature who has found its natural habitat. She was helping in the still room, learning from the housekeeper, making friends with the kitchen cat, and had recently been discovered reading one of my brother's more advanced books on estate management out of what appeared to be pure curiosity. My brother, informed of this, said nothing for a moment, and then told the housekeeper to give her access to the estate ledgers if she wanted them. Myra went through the ledgers in a week and came to him with 3 questions about the northern pasture rents, all 3 of which turned out to be genuinely astute. "They are both remarkable," I told my brother one evening. "Yes," he said. "Their uncle sold them as if they were furniture." "Yes," he said again, and this time the word had a weight to it that told me he had thought about this a great deal and was not finished thinking. The trouble came in January. I was in the library when the letter arrived, not the letter itself, but the information, carried by one of my brother's London agents who had ridden north through the worst of the winter weather with the single-mindedness of a man who knows his employer does not appreciate delays. I was not meant to be there. I had come to return a book and ended up sitting by the fire, and when the agent came in and bent to my brother's ear, I heard enough to understand the shape of it. Crispin Vane had been busy. In the months since Pemberton Hall, he had apparently reconsidered the terms of what he called his arrangement with the Duke of Caldreg, and decided that they were not sufficiently advantageous to himself. He had retained a solicitor of the particular kind that specializes in finding obligations where others see none, and this solicitor had produced a document. The document claimed, on the basis of certain secondary debt instruments from the late Lord Vane's estate, that Miss Alara Vane was still bound by an obligation entered into on her behalf, and that the Duke of Caldreg's payment had not discharged this particular obligation, which had been arranged separately, with a different creditor. The different creditor was a man called Sir Reginald Forthwick. He was 61 years old. He had been married twice, both wives dead within 5 years of the wedding, both deaths ruled natural and neither particularly mourned. He had a house in Cheshire and an estate in the north, and a reputation that his money had not managed to fully conceal, though it had tried. He had expressed, through his solicitor and through Crispin Vane, a desire to settle the remaining Vane obligations in exchange for Miss Alara Vane's hand in marriage. My brother read the letter his agent had brought. He read it twice. He set it down on the desk very carefully, the way he sets things down when he is deciding not to break them. Then he said to me, "Send word to Miss Vane, ask her to come to the study." I found her in the library at her usual station, cataloguing. She read the expression on my face before I said a word, and was already standing by the time I spoke. In the study my brother told her the full situation. He did not soften it. I think he judged, correctly, that she was not a woman who benefited from softened truths. He explained what the document claimed, who Sir Reginald Forthwick was, and what Crispin Vane intended. He laid it out in plain terms, and when he was finished she was standing very still with her hands at her sides, and her face had gone through several things I could see, and several more I could only guess at. "He cannot compel me," she said. "The law does not." "The law is a thing that can be argued," my brother said. "Forthwick has resources. Vane has a document, however questionable its basis. If they pursue it, it will be slow and costly, and the outcome is uncertain." He paused. "I want you to know the full situation." She looked at him. "What do you intend to do?" He looked back at her. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 4 seconds and contained, I believe, the essential truth of everything that had happened in the months since November. "I intend," he said slowly, "to make their document irrelevant." She waited. "There is one circumstance under which Sir Reginald Forthwick's claim has no legal footing whatsoever. If you are already engaged to be married—" He stopped. To me. The silence in the room changed character entirely. "Your Grace," she said after a moment, "you are proposing—" "I am proposing a practical measure," he said, and I recognized in his voice the tone he uses when he is saying one true thing in front of another true thing he is not yet prepared to say. "I am proposing an engagement that would serve as legal protection while my solicitors examine Vane's document and determine its validity. If it proves worthless, as I believe it will, the engagement can be dissolved by mutual agreement, with no harm to your reputation." He paused again. "I would not propose this if I did not believe it was the fastest and surest means of protecting you from a man who should not be within 50 miles of you." She looked at him for a long time. "You bought me at an auction," she said, "and now you propose to engage me." "I bought your uncle's claim," he said. "I have never had any claim on you." "And the engagement would be dissolved the moment it is no longer needed to protect you, if that is what you wish." He said it steadily. "I want that understood." She looked at him. He looked at her. I was standing to the side in an agony of brotherly impatience because I could see two things simultaneously: that he meant the protection genuinely, and that he was also, with every word, making a complete mess of what he actually wanted to say, but it was not my place to say so. "Yes," she said at last, "I accept." The announcement went out through the appropriate channels within 48 hours. My brother's solicitor descended on Vane's document like a hawk on a field mouse and tore it to pieces in a week. The secondary debt had been discharged years ago, documented clearly, and the entire construction rested on a fraud that Crispin Vane had apparently believed would not be examined too carefully, an assumption that proved disastrously incorrect when the examined was the Duke of Keldraig's legal team. Sir Reginald Forthwick's solicitor sent a letter withdrawing the claim with a brevity that suggested someone had advised Forthwick very strongly about the wisdom of pursuing grievances against Alastair Dreving. It should have been, as my brother had said, dissolved when no longer needed. It was not dissolved. It was not dissolved because of what happened in the 3 weeks following the announcement, during which the world of London society, which had not been paying a great deal of attention to Keldraig, suddenly very much was. The calls began first. Several ladies of my brother's acquaintance wrote to inquire about the engagement, in tones of polite astonishment that were imperfectly concealing naked curiosity. My brother ignored them. Then came the invitations to dinners, to winter assemblies, to a musicale in the country house of a countess who had apparently decided that any gathering attended by the Duke of Keldraig and his mysterious intended would be very well attended indeed. My brother ignored these too. What he did not ignore, and what I think began to shift something in him, was a dinner at a neighbor's house, Lord and Lady Tresham, honest people, old friends of the family, where Miss Vane came with him for the first time as his announced intended, and was introduced to a company of 30, and the company of 30 discovered over the course of the evening that she was one of the most genuinely interesting people in the room. I watched it happen. She did not try to be interesting. She was simply herself, direct and observant and warm in the way of someone who has never had the luxury of being otherwise. And by the time the evening was 3 hours old, she had talked seriously about crop rotation with Lord Tresham, who told me afterward that he had not had that particular conversation with anyone under 50, and had found it enormously refreshing. She discovered that the lady at her left had a cousin in Brittany, and proceeded to delight her with a conversation conducted largely in the regional dialect, switching between French and English with the ease of breathing, and the lady was so charmed that she wrote to Lady Tresham the following week to ask how one went about learning to speak it. She listened with real attention to a retired naval man's account of a storm off the coast of Normandy, not the polite performance of listening that people give to old men at dinner parties, but actual listening, asking a question at the end that told him she had understood every detail, and the man left the table that night looking as though he had been given a gift. And she gently but very firmly redirected a conversation about the Vane family's disgrace, begun by a woman named Mrs. Holcroft who specialized in this kind of thing, and had positioned herself near Alara with the deliberate strategy of a predator who has identified the weakest point in a territory. Away from Myra and onto a subject sufficiently dull that Mrs. Holcroft had lost interest by the time she realized what had happened. It was masterfully done. I had seen experienced hostesses fail to manage Mrs. Holcroft. Alara Vane did it in 4 sentences without raising her voice or abandoning her pleasant expression, and Mrs. Holcroft departed for the other end of the room looking mildly puzzled about how she had arrived there. My brother watched all of this from across the room with the expression of a man adding something to a calculation he thought was already complete. On the carriage ride home, Miss Vane said, looking out at the dark moors, "Mrs. Holcroft will try again." "Yes," my brother said. "She is the kind of woman who believes that a ruined reputation is a fixed thing." "She is incorrect," he said. She turned from the window and looked at him, How certain are you?" He met her eyes. "Very," he said, and the word was not a comfort, it was a statement of intent, and she heard it as such. She looked back at the window. "Your Grace." "Alistair," he said. She was quiet. "My brother calls me Alistair," he said. "It would not be entirely odd if you—" "Alistair," she said, trying it, and something in his shoulders shifted, just slightly, the way a held thing shifts when the holding becomes unnecessary. "Ilara," he said. They did not speak again on the road home, but the silence was a different kind of silence than the one they had been keeping. The dissolution of the engagement did not come up again. I waited for it. I think, on some level, she waited for it too, waited for him to tell her that the danger had passed, that Vane's document was destroyed, that the engagement had served its purpose and might now be set aside with mutual courtesy and no regret. He did not say it, and she did not ask. What she did was keep working. She finished the library catalog in late January, a document so thorough and well organized that the castle's housekeeper said it was the first time in her 30 years at Caeldraig that she could actually find anything. She turned to the estate correspondence, took over the management of a complicated negotiation with a tenant farmer that had been stalling for 2 months, and resolved it in a fortnight by the simple method of writing a letter that was honest about the estate's intentions, while being genuinely fair about the farmer's situation. She rode in the mornings when the weather allowed, on a gray mare from the stables that had been deemed too temperamental for general use, and that she had apparently simply decided to get along with, and they had reached some kind of understanding that the stable master found baffling and touching in equal measure. She was alive here, is what I am saying. She had come in November like a woman holding her breath underwater, and by February she had surfaced, and the difference was visible to anyone paying attention. My brother paid attention. He began joining her on the morning rides. He did not announce this. He simply appeared one morning at the stable with his gray, when she was already saddled and waiting, and said nothing, and she said nothing, and they rode out together across the moors in the January cold with only the wind and the dogs and the flat white sky. They did this the next morning, and the next, and soon it was simply what they did, and the grooms accepted it with the equanimity of people who have learned that the household arrangements at Caeldraig follow no predictable rules. I joined them twice, and made the mistake of attempting conversation, which was clearly not the point of the enterprise. The point, as I eventually understood it, was that they could be together without any of the weight of circumstance, without the auction or the engagement or the document or the ruined estate or any of it, just 2 people and the moors and the gray morning, and that this had become necessary to both of them, though neither had said so. What I observed on the second morning I accompanied them was this: they had developed, without any apparent negotiation, the habit of riding at the same pace on the open moor, not racing ahead of each other, not hanging back, and when the track narrowed near the stone wall that marks the estate's northern boundary, my brother drew his horse aside to let hers through first. It was an entirely natural thing, the kind of small courtesy that comes from habit and consideration and knowing another person's way. He did it without thinking. She accepted it without comment. But I saw his expression in the moment, that unguarded moment when he was watching her ride ahead, and he did not know I was watching him, and what was on his face was so plainly and entirely itself, that I looked away and studied the moors for a while, because a man is entitled to his private feelings even when his younger brother is 3 lengths behind him on a gray horse in the January cold. It was Myra in the end who said it plainly. She found me in the corridor one afternoon in late February, with the directness of a person who has been thinking something for some time, and has decided to say it to whoever happens to be available. "He's in love with her," she said. "Yes," I agreed. "And she paused, considering it. She is terrified." I said nothing. "Not of him," she said. "She is terrified of hoping. She looked at me with the dark, serious eyes she shared with her sister. She has not had a great deal of cause to hope. She is afraid that if she says it aloud it will be taken from her. I thought about what to say. Has she said as much to you? She doesn't say things like that, but I know her. She tilted her head. Does he know how to say it, your brother? Badly, I said honestly. He is better at it in writing. Then perhaps, she said, with the certainty of a 17-year-old who has been reading estate ledgers for sport and now considers herself qualified to manage most situations, someone should suggest that. The letter was Myra's idea. I cannot take any credit for it. She was a remarkable girl, Myra Vane, and whatever career she goes on to have, it will be thorough and well-organized and devastating to anyone who underestimates her. My brother wrote it in one sitting, late at night, and I know because I was in the next room and I heard him stop and start and stop again. The particular rhythm of someone who knows exactly what they want to say and keeps finding that every version of it is not quite right, not quite honest enough, not quite worth the saying if it is not the truest version possible. When I came in the following morning, the writing table had 3 crumpled sheets beside it, and one that had been folded and sealed, and set to one side with the decisiveness of a man who has chosen his best attempt and is done revising. He was standing at the window looking out at the moors with his tea going cold in his hand, which told me everything. He turned when I came in. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has said something that cannot be unsaid, and is uncertain whether it was the right thing to say, and absolutely certain he could not have gone on not saying it. I have written to Alara, he said. I see that. I have told her, he stopped. He looked at the sealed letter. I have told her the truth of it, that the engagement need not be dissolved unless she wishes it, that I do not wish it. He paused. That I have not wished it for some time, and that I should have said so directly weeks ago rather than finding reasons to delay. That she has become. He stopped again. My brother, who can compose 3 pages of clear and decisive business correspondence in 20 minutes, who argued a property case in front of an assembled board of solicitors for 90 minutes without consulting a note, who has never been at a loss for the right word in any professional context, was unable to complete a sentence about Alara Vane. It was, I thought, one of the most honest things I had ever seen him do. Good, I said. What if she? Then you will know, I said, and you will have said it, which is better than not saying it. I picked up my coat. I would not delay. He looked at the letter for one more moment. He picked it up and I left him to it. She received the letter in the library, where she was still working, always finding the next thing to be done, because she was a woman who had survived by staying useful and had not yet entirely learned to believe that usefulness was not the condition of her welcome. I watched her from the doorway, unseen, as she broke the seal and read. Her face, which was always so composed, did something I had only seen it do once before in the carriage leaving Pemberton Hall, the moment she had allowed herself to exhale. It did it again now, but larger. Her hands holding the letter were very still, and then her eyes closed briefly, and when she opened them again she was not entirely in control of her expression, and what was on her face was exactly what Myra had said. It was hope, and it was afraid of itself, and it was trying not to hope too hard in case the world was simply being the world again. She was up from the desk before I could move away from the door, and she came into the corridor and we nearly collided, and she said, "Where is he?" without any preamble whatsoever. "The study," I said, "third door on the—" She was already walking. I did not follow her into the study. I am not entirely without discretion. But I stood in the corridor at a perfectly reasonable distance and heard, through the closed door, the low sound of my brother's voice, and then her voice, and then a silence, and then, and this is the part I will remember as long as I live, the sound of my brother laughing. My brother does not laugh as a general principle. It is not that he is incapable of it. It is that he has very rarely in all his adult life had sufficient occasion. The sound of it through that closed door was so unexpected and so entirely itself that I sat down on the bench in the corridor and stayed there for quite some time, for no reason I could name except that some things deserve to be given a moment. The letter became the beginning of a different kind of conversation, a conversation that had nothing to do with practical measures or estate correspondence or the legal dissolution of anything. They talked, in the evenings, in the way of people who have discovered that the other person is worth every minute of the time available and are now, somewhat urgently, making up for the time previously squandered on avoidance and professional courtesy. They disagreed about things. She thought his approach to the northern tenant dispute was unnecessarily combative, and he thought she underestimated how persistent the opposition would be, and they were both right. And the resulting argument was conducted with such genuine engagement and mutual sharpness that I stayed later than I had intended simply to hear how it resolved. It resolved, eventually, with a synthesis that was better than either position had been alone, which told me more about the quality of their minds together than any number of individual performances would have. She read to him from the translated letters one evening, in both French and English, her voice moving between the two languages with the ease of someone entirely at home in both. He watched her with an expression so openly devoted that the housekeeper, who had come in to see about the fire and found them so arranged, Alara at the desk, with the candle pulling the warmth into her face, Alastair in the chair opposite her with his book closed on his knee and his full attention on her voice, retreated without saying a word, and told the kitchen cat the next morning that it was about time. A sentiment the kitchen cat received with the philosophical equanimity, that is, the cat's particular gift. He gave her, one afternoon in late February, a key. It was a small iron key on a ribbon, and it opened the glass case in the library that contained the oldest volumes, the ones that had been locked away since his grandfather's time on the grounds that they were too fragile for casual handling. They should be read, he said, setting the key on the desk in front of her. They are not doing anyone any good behind glass. It was 3 times the gesture it looked, if you understood my brother. Those volumes had been off-limits to everyone in the castle for 40 years, including him. She understood. She took the key and said, "Thank you, Alastair," and his name in her voice was still new enough that I saw him attend to it, the way a person attends to something they have been waiting for without quite knowing how much they were waiting. There was still Crispin Vane. He wrote in March. He wrote with the persistence of a man who has not yet understood that he is out of resources, and he made demands about the estate, about Myra, about the family name, about obligations he claimed were owed to him, about decorum. My brother's solicitor responded to the first letter. My brother did not respond to the second. When the third arrived, longer, more strident, threatening a visit, my brother looked at it for a moment and then said, quietly, "Ilara." She read it, she set it down. "He will come," she said. "Yes. He cannot compel anything. Your solicitors have made that clear." "No, but he will come and make a scene and expect that the scene itself will produce something." He looked at her. "We could prevent the scene. Or," she said after a moment, "we could let him come." He looked at her. "He will come and make his demands," she said, "and we will have occasion to be very clear in front of whatever witnesses are present about where he stands." She paused. "I would like," she said carefully, "to be the one who says it to him, if you are willing." "I am entirely willing," he said. Crispin Vane arrived on a Thursday in late March, unannounced, which had been his method of arriving since he was a young man who believed surprise gave him the upper hand. He had, I suspect, imagined that arriving without notice would find us unprepared, would find Alara perhaps alone, or uncertain, or in some posture of domestic invisibility that would allow him to establish his authority before anyone could arrange to contest it. He did not know my brother. He did not know Alara, and he had apparently not considered the possibility that a man who had built an estate on careful intelligence would have had ample notice of the carriage leaving London 3 days prior. He was shown into the great hall, which at that hour contained my brother, myself, my brother's solicitor, the castle's steward, and 3 of the senior household staff who had found reasons to be nearby. Crispin Vane looked at the assembled company and understood, I think, that the upper hand was not going to be his today. He covered this with bluster, which is what he always did, because bluster was the only tool he had, and he had spent a lifetime sharpening it against people with fewer resources than himself. He spoke of the family name. He spoke of obligations. He spoke of the late Lord Vane's wishes and what they would have meant had his brother lived. He spoke at some length about the impropriety of the current situation, 2 young women resident in a bachelor household. He managed to invest the word resident with a particular kind of slime that made my brother's jaw tighten in a way I recognized as dangerous. And he spoke, finally, about his continued role as legal guardian to Miss Myra Vane and what responsibilities that entailed. Alara was standing to my brother's left. She had dressed that morning in a gown the color of deep water, mended at no sleeve whatsoever, and her hair was arranged as it always was, and she looked exactly like what she was, a composed and capable woman who had decided some time ago what she thought of Crispin Vane, and was now prepared to say it in measured, precise, and utterly devastating English. She waited until he had finished. She said, "Uncle Crispin." He turned to her. He had the expression of a man who expects what follows to be negotiable. "You sold me," she said, "at a dinner table in a room full of men I had never met, as payment for a debt my father could not settle. You presented me as an asset. You argued about my attributes like a man describing a horse to a buyer." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "And you are standing in this house now, speaking to me about the family name." The room was entirely silent. "My sister and I are no longer under any obligation to you," she continued. "The Duke of Caeldraig's solicitors have made this clear in writing on 3 separate occasions, as has the relevant law, as has simple human decency, though I appreciate that last point may not carry significant weight with you. You have no claim on us. You have no claim on this house. You have no claim on anything that happens inside these walls." She paused. "And I would very much like you to leave." Crispin Vane's face went through a remarkable variety of colors. My brother took 1 step forward, not speaking, simply present, the step that said, without a word, that the next person to speak or move in a way that required him to speak would find the experience unpleasant. It was a step I have seen him take twice in legal disputes and once at a horse fair, and it has never failed to resolve the situation. Crispin Vane left. His carriage was gone before the hall fire had finished settling. In the quiet that followed, Myra, who had been standing at the top of the stairs where she had absolutely not been listening, descended with a face of profound satisfaction. The housekeeper disappeared in the direction of the kitchen to, I suspected, share the news. The steward permitted himself a small smile. The solicitor made a note that I believe was mostly decorative. My brother looked at Alara. "Well done," he said, which is his highest form of praise, and she knew it. And the look that passed between them in that moment was not a thing I will try to describe, because I am a younger brother with a limited command of poetry. The announcement of their formal engagement went to London society in April. I say formal because the practical engagement had, by then, become something else entirely without anyone quite noticing the transition. The way a fire that was started for warmth becomes simply the center of the room. The letters of congratulation were numerous, and, in several cases, extremely confused, because the Duke of Caeldraig was not known to be a man who engaged himself to anyone, and certainly not to a woman whose family had been publicly ruined, and the London gossips who had spent the winter speculating about the situation were now required to update their conclusions in light of the fact that the conclusions had apparently been correct, and they had been too cautious to say so. Mrs. Holcroft wrote to a mutual acquaintance that she had always thought the match had great promise. She had not, I happen to know, said so at any point prior to the announcement. But the rewriting of history is a particular talent of people like Mrs. Holcroft, and I have learned not to waste energy arguing with it. They were married in June, in the small stone chapel on the castle grounds, with the moors still gold from the late spring and the wind for once behaving itself. Myra stood with her sister, wearing a gown she had chosen herself in a shade of pale amber that suited her exactly, and her face was the face of someone who has navigated a very great deal of difficulty and has arrived somewhere safe and warm and intends to stay. I stood with my brother. The household was present to a person, from the housekeeper in her best dress to the stable master, who had ridden back from the north pasture that morning specifically not to miss it. The groundskeeper's daughter was there with her father, wearing a ribbon in her hair and holding very still with the gravity of a child who understands this is an important occasion. The dogs were not present, technically, but two of them had found their way to the chapel door and were sitting there in the sun when we came out, which I chose to interpret as approval. I stood beside my brother in the moment before the ceremony began, and he looked, I want to say this accurately, because I have never quite said it and I want to say it right. He looked like a man who has spent most of his life carrying something very heavy and has just set it down. Not relieved exactly. More as though he had discovered that the weight had not been necessary, that he had carried it out of habit and caution, and the accumulated conclusions of a life that had not given him many reasons to put it down, and now someone had quietly, steadily, without asking him to make any grand gesture about it, simply made it possible to set it aside. She came up the chapel aisle on no one's arm, because there was no one whose arm she needed or wanted, and my brother watched her the whole way, and his expression was the one I had last seen through the doorway that night in February, entirely, completely, unguardedly devoted. When she reached him, she looked up at him and he looked down at her, and neither of them said anything, but the saying was all there in the looking. Afterward, when the ceremony was over and the household had managed a reasonable approximation of a celebration in the great hall, I found myself standing with Myra near the window that looks out over the moors, and she said, with the tone of a young woman who has been proven correct and is gratified but not surprised, "He was worth hoping for in the end." I looked at where my brother was standing across the room, Alara beside him, her hand in his, not performing the gesture for the room, simply resting there, the way a thing rests when it is in the right place, talking to the old groundskeeper with the ease of people who have nowhere else they need to be. "Yes," I said. "He was." That is the story of how Alastair Dreving, Duke of Caeldraig, bought a woman at auction on a Tuesday evening in November, and spent every day afterward proving that the world which had priced her had been wrong about her value, and wrong about his, and wrong about most things that matter. The men in that room at Pemberton Hall had looked at Alara Vane and seen a settlement sum. My brother had looked at her and seen a woman who stood with her chin up and her eyes on the far wall, and refused, with every line of her body, to be reduced to what the room had decided she was. She never was, that is the point. She never was anything but what she is, and what she is, I am glad to say, is the Duchess of Caeldraig, and the most remarkable person my brother has ever had the good fortune to love. He would agree with me if I asked him. He is not, as I have said, a sentimental man, but there are things he agrees with readily enough, and that is one of them.